Good evening. I'm Michele Greenstein, filling in for Rick Sanchez. The U.S. Department of Justice is indicting 3 J.P. Morgan Chase traders for manipulating the commodities market and racketeering. These 3 men, including the head of the precious metals trading desk, have been charged, among other things, under the RICO Act. Now, the RICO Act has traditionally been associated with the mafia. But here we have the Justice Department of the U.S. saying, quote, this is precisely the kind of conduct the RICO statute is meant to punish. Essentially, the DOJ is calling the precious metals trading desk at J.P. Morgan a criminal enterprise. Here's what these men did, allegedly. They placed fake orders of precious metals like gold and silver to trick the market and manipulate prices. They placed these orders with no intention of following through on them. This is called spoofing the market. And the indictment by the government explains that this allowed them to, quote, generate trading profits for themselves and other members of the precious metals desk. These traders made millions of dollars for the firm at the expense of other parties, including the bank's own clients. And according to the U.S. government, this has been going on for 8 years, from 2008 to 2016. These executives, along with 8 other unnamed co-conspirators, were spoofing the market for close to a decade. Furthermore, Assistant Attorney General Brian Benskowski is hinting that there may be more prosecution ahead for J.P. Morgan, saying that the DOJ will, quote, follow the facts where they lead, whether it's across desks here or at any other bank or upwards into the financial institution. But perhaps there's an even bigger story and an even broader manipulation by J.P. Morgan going on. It's a developing story, and we will be bringing you all the details as we uncover them. It's the news with Rick Sanchez. It's time to do news again. Here's the list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Why is a Hong Kong protester testifying before the U.S. Congress? Are we closer than ever to a potential conflict, a war even, with Iran? And will we wake up tomorrow with a new Prime Minister of Israel? Let's get started. We begin tonight in Hong Kong, where a widespread protest movement has taken place since June. We reported extensively right here on this program that what started as opposition to an extradition law amendment has now morphed into a broad anti-China movement over the course of the summer. And remember this guy? Joshua Wong, the young man famous for leading the anti-China movement in Hong Kong since at least 2014. We've reported on the connections between him and both the government officials and think tanks right here in Washington, D.C. Well, today, Wong is here in D.C., lobbying for something called the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act allows the U.S. government to sanction individuals who it decides are violating human rights in Hong Kong. It's a bill that's been heavily advocated for by a group of political parties in Hong Kong that call themselves the Pan-Democrats. The founding chairman of one of these parties even confirmed to me while I was in Hong Kong that he's been pushing U.S. officials to pass this bill. His name is Martin Lee, founding chairman of the Hong Kong Democratic Party and recipient of multiple awards from U.S. institutions, including a Democracy Award, which you can see right behind him, from the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, this endowment, while technically not part of the United States government, has a budget that is authorized by the U.S. Congress and distributed through the U.S. State Department. Additionally, the founding and current president of the Endowment for Democracy even admitted that it was created to continue the work of the CIA without the CIA's stigma. And it's hardly a secret that the work of the CIA includes this: destabilizing foreign governments via activities that include, but are not limited to, funding its opposition. Now, while I was in Hong Kong, I also spoke with Regina Ip, a member of both the Executive Council and the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. I first asked her about the role that these Pan-Democrats play in Hong Kong politics.
I think their policy basically is anti-China. A lot of time they act contrary to their pledges, and they do things which are really hurtful to the overall public interest of Hong Kong.
Now, it's no secret that the United States is in an unprecedented economic war. That's not just a trade war with China right now. Do you see the issues of Hong Kong being used by the U.S. government to further their own agenda?
There is rising evidence that Hong Kong is being used as a pawn because President Trump kept changing his tune. Sometimes he said this is an internal matter for China, but sometimes he said, the trade dispute, if it were not for the trade dispute, Hong Kong would be in worse shape, Clearly linking Hong Kong with the trade dispute, which is actually, as you say, a geopolitical struggle.
Not only does it seem that the United States is using the situation in Hong Kong, but some actually allege that the United States is fueling the situation in Hong Kong. So I want to talk about that for a little bit. I understand it's illegal for a political party in Hong Kong to take money from a foreign government, correct?
Yeah.
But is it illegal for a political party to take money from a foreign NGO?
That's not illegal. Definitely. There are gray areas, An NGO, giving money in the cause of promoting democracy, there's nothing we can do about it.
The situation in Hong Kong domestically has actually been on the decline.
Yes.
Some would say for the past couple decades. We have housing prices rising, inequalities increasing. I believe 1 in 5 people live in poverty. Due to the high degree of central planning in mainland China, many people have undoubtedly been lifted out of poverty in recent years. Do you suppose that people in Hong Kong are perhaps looking at that and looking at that economic growth and going, hey, why isn't that happening over here? And then blaming Beijing for neglect?
I don't think they blame Beijing because our own officials make our economic policy. I think our mistakes is to have hang on to the, Milton Friedman School of Free Market Economy of the 1970s for too long, rather than adjusting to the new realities. In the West, people don't talk about just free market. They talk about more compassionate form of capitalism, more sustainable form of capitalism, not just putting shareholders' value before purpose. I think our government really needs to take a hard look at our, old ideology.
Your government's not the only one. Do you think it would be possible for such a widespread protest movement to exist here in Hong Kong had there not been serious social inequities?
You see, a lot of young people think that they're taking part in a revolution. They are being a force for change for the better. But actually, if there had not been the sort of social inequities that you described, they would not be on the streets.
Do you think that Hong Kong's special status as being highly autonomous has been, in aggregate, good or bad for the working class?
That's a difficult question. I think the livelihood of the working class is not determined by the level of autonomy we have. It's really determined by whether our government is able to make good social and economic policies. And I think we have not been able to make the best policies that work in the interest of the average man in the street.
I've only been here for a couple of weeks, but it seems like, especially among the youth, the term Beijing is a bit synonymous with the term bad guy. Why has this happened?
I think many of us believe they have been brainwashed in school and at colleges by a lot of teachers who are cynical, and take an adverse view of China, because of their mindless espousal of Western values. They cannot see China's development in a more objective light. And also, I think a lot of our young people feel threatened by the economic rise of China, because it is a fact that many of us are not as competitive as mainland students or mainland graduates. So some of the anti-China feelings could stem from a sense of insecurity.
Senior U.S. officials are now telling media outlets they know where this weekend's attack on 2 key Saudi Arabian oil facilities originated: Iran. The U.S. is saying that at least a dozen missiles and more than 20 drones were involved. And today, a senior U.S. official told CBS News that there's a, quote, very compelling forensic case that Iran was responsible. In fact, we're learning now that the Trump administration is weighing options on how to respond to Iran, with military leaders providing the president with a menu of possible actions on Monday. This comes after the Houthi rebels of Yemen, who have been engaged in a resistance to a Saudi-led war on Yemen for 4 years now, actually claimed responsibility for this attack, saying it was retribution for Saudi Arabia's criminal activity in the region. This also comes as Iran's foreign ministry denied the accusations by U.S. officials and maintains the position that the attack came from what they call Yemeni victims. Joining me now from Tehran is Professor Mohammed Marandi from the University of Tehran. Now, Professor, first I want to talk about what we're hearing from Saudi Arabia. This country is kind of echoing the claims of the United States that Iranian weapons were used to attack the Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. How likely is it that these claims are true?
I don't think anyone in Iran believes it because the United States has a strong military presence in the Persian Gulf. They have many naval ships. They have many bases. Western countries have bases. They're well established here. So it's very difficult to imagine that a host of Iranian missiles and drones flew over the Persian Gulf and then struck targets in Saudi Arabia without detection. Or if it came from the north and they flew over Iraq, it's the same thing. The United States, their Air Force flies over this region. They have a huge presence across the board. And Saudi Arabia has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on their military, and it's been focused on Iran. So all of their installations are alongside the Persian Gulf region and directed towards any potential so-called Iranian threat. So how could such a thing be that the Iranians would carry out such a massive strike, yet no one in the American or Saudi military is able to detect it? On the other hand, the Ansarullah, the Yemenis, the Houthis, they've been carrying out more and more drone strikes and missile strikes in Saudi Arabia. That their technology has been evolving over the last 4.5 years. They've been going deeper inside Saudi Arabia. They've been very accurate in striking their targets, many of them oil installations. So it's quite believable that they would do it. But the real issue is not Iran or the United States, it's Saudi Arabia and Yemen. If the Saudis would stop the massacres and the slaughter and the starvation in Yemen, the war would come to an end and there would be no more strikes on Saudi Arabia.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about that because what I'm hearing you say is that if the Houthis of Yemen did this, they did this, like they claim, as retaliation for Saudi Arabian crimes in the region. On the other hand, what you're saying as evidence that it was in Iran is not that Iran doesn't have the capabilities, but it's that it's impossible Iran could do this without being detected by the U.S. So I want to ask you this. Is it possible that it was Iran and that the United States simply allowed this to happen?
Well, I would put it differently. I would say that if it was Iran, then the U.S. military presence in this region is worthless, and U.S. weapons are worthless, and their radar systems are worthless, and their missile defense systems are all worthless. So the Americans have discredited their military by being completely unable to detect such an attack.
Now, many analysts say that a major hot war, that is, a conventional war against Iran by the U.S., is virtually impossible. Economically, we know the U.S. is already waging a war on Iran. But in terms of a hot war, what is the actual possibility?
I think it's not likely, Michele, because if the United States even carries out a limited attack on Iran, Iran's retaliation will be very extensive. It will be disproportionate. The Iranians have already stated this to the Americans twice through diplomatic channels. They will hit back very hard. And not only will they hit the Americans hard, but they will hit those countries that have allowed the Americans to have a presence on their soil. Saudi Arabia would not survive a war with Iran, and neither would the United Arab Emirates. They would collapse almost immediately. And right now, the Saudis are incapable of fighting Yemen. They've lost the war. So imagine if they began a conflict with Iran as well. They could not survive both the Yemenis to the southwest and the Iranians on the other side of the Persian Gulf. And you have many Iraqis who have huge grievances against Saudi Arabia for their support for ISIS and Al-Qaeda in all these years, and all the explosions and the murders that were carried out in Iraq by these groups that were funded by Saudi Arabia.
Now
if there is a war, the United States would lose its key client regimes.
Now, you've spoken in the past about how Iran and its allies are ready for war, that they don't invite conflict, but they are fully prepared. When I hear this, to me, this sounds very similar to how United States officials are speaking, are making announcements that they don't want war, but if their enemies are going to force our hand, we will be, prepared to launch the full might of the United States military. What's the difference in these two countries and the way that they're, talking to the international community about the way that they are ready to engage militarily?
Michele, I survived 2 chemical attacks in the 1980s. Many others didn't. Those chemical weapons were given by the United States and its European partners and allies to Saddam Hussein. The United States has been sanctioning Iran for decades. The United States under Obama carried and initiated these sanctions that we see today, and tried to make Iranians suffer as much as possible. Obama called them crippling sanctions. His intention was to cripple Iranians. Trump carried out what he called brutal sanctions. He wanted to brutalize the Iranian population. The maximum pressure campaign is to make Iranians suffer as much as possible, to prevent them from doing trade, importing food, importing medicine. This is how the United States treats Iranians. This is their intention. Iran has never initiated any conflict with the United States. And even now, the U.S. president has repeatedly said he has spoken about obliterating Iran. So when the United States carries out acts of aggression, tries to harm the Iranian population, tries to kill Iranians, and make such threats, there is no moral equivalence here. The Iranians are simply saying, if you start a war, we will finish it. We will strike back hard. We will destroy all those oil and gas assets and the ships and the tankers in the Persian Gulf if you push for war. So the Iranians are basically saying, back off. That's why the Iranians accepted the nuclear deal. The Iranians wanted to bring about a more favorable atmosphere. The Iranians gave concessions to bring about stability, and then Trump goes and tears the deal. Obama didn't abide by the deal. He also betrayed it, but Trump totally ripped it apart. So who is to blame here, the Iranians or the United States?
It's a race still too close to call. The Israeli election is coming down to the line between sitting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of the Likud party and Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Alliance. Let's go live to RT correspondent Paula Sleer, who's in Tel Aviv right now with the latest.
Well, we have an election here that ultimately might seem the country's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, no longer serving in the top office. Now, he's been in position such that he is the longest serving Prime Minister, and he was hoping to serve a 5th term in office. The initial exit polls suggest that he's either in 2nd place or tied 1st with the leader of the centre-left Blue and White party that is headed by a former Israeli Defense Forces chief, Benny Gantz. Now, the result isn't largely unexpected. But what it does mean is that with no outright leader, the focus now turns on coalition building. And even in that respect, Netanyahu is not faring well. It seems highly unlikely that he'll be able to put together a majority coalition, and he needs at least 61 out of 120 parliamentary seats to actually be able to secure himself as the next Prime Minister. You'll remember that these elections came about because back in April we had the same scenario. Netanyahu won the most number of votes, but but because of the fact that he wasn't able to secure 61 seats, he had to actually stave off those elections and call for new ones now. So we're witnessing the second election in 6 months, and now questions are being asked as to whether or not there'll be a third, another election moving further down the line, because here too there's no clear outright majority and no clear leader. The country's president, Ruven Rivlin, says that he'll do everything he can to try and prevent this from happening. He says that he will, if necessary, give an extension to the leader that has the most number of seats and is tasked with forming the next government to try and ease the situation. The final results will come out on the 25th of this month, and then we're likely to see weeks, if not months, of political wrangling. One of the questions, of course, has been how the Arab parties did. So far, they seem to have secured third position. There was more than 60% voter turnout amongst the 20% of the population that makes up the Arab vote. So they certainly have done particularly well. As for Netanyahu, this certainly is not a good result. He was relying on the support that he has from the American President Donald Trump to also boost him forward. But whereas in April, Donald Trump, just before the elections were held, made the dramatic announcement that he recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, this time around there's been no such announcement from the American president. And the result as such is that most Israelis feel that it's a given that Netanyahu and Trump work closely together. It certainly is a feather in the cap of Netanyahu, but it hasn't earned him any more seats going this time around. Netanyahu, of course, also faces 3 corruption charges, and he would have been hoping that another term in office would see him being able to stave off some of those corruption charges. The question now is, if he's no longer prime minister, what will be the historical legacy that he'll leave? Will it be a legacy of Israel's longest-serving prime minister, or will it be a legacy of a prime minister that potentially could spend his last year's worst-case scenario in prison? So there really is a lot happening on the Israeli political front. But in the bigger picture, we have a scenario here that now is much the same as it was 6 months ago.
RT correspondent Paula Sleer reporting to us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you. Speaking to a newspaper last week, American ambassador to Serbia, Kyle Scott, seemed to dismiss the severity of 1999's NATO bombing campaign. Now, this bombing campaign was 78 days long, and it involved NATO dropping 3,000 cruise missiles and over 80,000 bombs throughout Yugoslavia, killing almost 4,000 people. Here's what Scott said. He said this: "Yes, I know that well. Maybe I would feel the same in their place, but neither Serbia nor the United States can turn back the clock. What we can do now is look at 1999 in a broader perspective. It's been 2 decades since. It's time to go forward and improve our relations, and we have a very good basis for such progress." Now, for more on all this, we're joined by RT producer Nebojsa Malic. Firstly, thank you for joining me.
Anytime, Michele.
Secondly, I'd like to get your raw reaction on what we just heard Mr. Scott say.
Well, I've grown to expect these outbursts from the outgoing ambassador. He's ending his term in Serbia soon, and I'm guessing his successor has been nominated, but is waiting for Senate approval. It was part of his exit interview, I suppose, with the Serbian press. He said these things before, and this has sort of been the official line at the State Department ever since 1999, which is a bit disappointing considering that the governments have changed twice since then. I'm more disappointed that here's somebody who's saying, well, you know, we need to look forward, not backward, you know, ignore our history. And then in a previous breath, he was saying, oh, but remember the wonderful history we've had together before this. Well, it's not Serbia that forgot that history. It's the U.S. that forgot that history when it started bombing in '99. And it's been doing this ever since.
So you can't pick and choose which history we'd like to actually examine.
Right. It's certainly one of those convenient little things that history exists when and whenever Mr. Scott wants it to exist, and then ceases to exist magically. It'll be important when he doesn't.
All right. Now, what I'm hearing you say is that you're disappointed but not surprised. I want to take a step back and talk about Serbia on the international stage. Now, is Serbia preparing to join the EU right now, or does it see itself as politically isolated?
Well, officially, its government is committed to entering the EU, but obviously that process is not going anywhere fast. At best, they can hope for a place in the waiting room, which Turkey's been in for the past 30 years, if I think correctly. So there's no actual date for accession. And all of this talk about joining the EU is a polite fiction, and I don't really know what the U.S. has to do with any of this, because the U.S. is not a part of the EU, unless we've missed the memo somewhere. Secondly, the current Serbian government is actually preparing to sign a free trade pact with the Eurasian Union in October next month. And that's got Washington very, very concerned, because in the grand geopolitical strategy of Europe, the Balkans, that little Western Balkans blot that's not completely filled in with EU ink, is a vital part of their strategy. And so they have to find a way to get it under control permanently, because that's what was behind the bombing in '99. It wasn't the humanitarian intervention was just a pretext. It was a geopolitical issue. Now,
I know you said the U.S. is not part of the EU. However, it does have strong ties to the EU. It's probably its main ally. Without the U.S., the EU would be virtually powerless. I want to bring the U.S. into this by asking you if you could give our audience kind of a lay of the land in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and Serbia, because it's not a country we usually report on here.
Right. Well, I mean, Serbia has had almost 2 centuries of diplomatic relations with the U.S. They were right about there in age in terms of being modern countries. The Serbian uprising against the Ottoman occupation happened in 1805, 1804, ultimately succeeding a little bit later down the road. The issue is that Serbia has been part of Yugoslavia for the better part of the 20th century, ever since 1919, and so it didn't really have a separate path until the 1990s, when the U.S. endorsed Yugoslavia's breakup along these arbitrarily drawn boundaries during the latter part of the century under a communist government, which the U.S. backed, unlike most of them in Eastern Europe. And so we're talking all of a sudden selective principles again, where, you know, the U.S. is going to bat for, say, Lithuania or Slovenia, but not Serbia, because its borders are subject to revision, whereas, you know, Bosnia or Croatia are not. And I've had this conversation with Rick a little while before, but the issue is that the U.S. has been intensely hypocritical about the 1990s breakup of Yugoslavia and how it treated specific republics in that course of events. And Serbia, which had grown used to being an ally of the Americans in 2 world wars, all of a sudden found itself a target.
Right. And when you say the U.S. endorsed this breakup, you could say that that's using a very light term. Now, 1999, this is not ancient history, right? These people are still alive. Can you talk a little bit about how the population is still affected by that bombing campaign?
Well, the bombing campaign came at a tail end of about a decade of sanctions. So, as Professor Marandi was just saying, you first sanctioned the people into despair, and then you bombed them into physical destruction. The economy has never recovered. The sheer amount of disease from depleted uranium and other munitions has skyrocketed. The healthcare system is incredibly burdened by this. The successive governments that have been installed since the revolution in 2000 have been very problematic. So it's been a very problematic experience.
Thank you, RT producer Nebojsa Malic. Damning picture you paint for us. That's our news. Thank you for being with us. If you have friends looking for a newscast that's really not like the rest, tell them to catch us on YouTube. See you here in a half hour.